I'm preaching about John Haynes Holmes, and John Haynes Holmes didn't write his sermons until the day after he preached them. So I'm trying it out. He did have notes, though. Most of his notes were quotes, so I have notes of quotes, things that he said. The Reverend Dr. John Haynes Holmes is wildly inspiring to me. I will tell you before getting here, I don't know that I'd ever really heard of him, maybe sort of in passing. I had no idea the influence he had. I had no idea the ways that he created American life, that he created what we know to be church. I had no idea that he was who he was. And I don't know if you do either. And even as I learn more and more, I realize how much I still have to know. In fact, in my dream, I'm going to write a book because I think that this man's history needs to be known. John Haynes Holmes came here in 1906 to preach his first sermon. He was here until he died at the age of 84. This was his. He arrived here at Church of the Messiah, which was, so you know, built as a cathedral. It was on the corner of 34th and Park. It was a cathedral for Unitarianism. And he was called to this pulpit, he said, in a completely ridiculous moment because he was all of 27 years old. He thought, there is no way that you call the 27-year-old to this pulpit. It was an important pulpit, one of the most important in the country, and yet he was the one they brought in. He was known as something of a radical, but he was also really well established. His family were Puritans going way back. His father's family arrived here in 1620. His mother's family in 1635. They were Puritans / Congregationalists / Unitarians from the very beginning. So in some way it may have made some sense, but to him he thought that was sort of nuts. But he showed up here and was immediately struck. There's no possible way for me to tell you everything there is to know about this man. So I'm going to stick with three things. One of them is his move for economic justice and his commitment to racial justice and his commitment to nonviolence. But when he arrived here and he stood on the corner, right? Imagine it just for a moment. He's on the corner of 34th and Park with this cathedral behind him. And it's 1906 when he first shows up, and he's looking kind of over to Fifth Avenue, where the fashionable people, the powerful people, right? Astor had a massive mansion right on the corner of 34th and 5th. It was where everything happened. And then about 2 or 3 blocks down, over on 3rd and say 30th, were the tenements. Now the people who lived in the tenements served the people who lived on Fifth Avenue. But he stood at this cathedral and thought, this is not okay. And then people walked into his church and he discovered this was the Fifth Avenue crowd. These were the people with money. This included the chairman of the stock exchange. This included the chairman, who knew we had one of these? The New York Cotton Exchange. It included the second wealthiest oil man in the country. It included the people with power, and he was unclear how he was going to help these people to understand that the way they lived may not be compatible with his theology and may not be compatible with his faith. And so he decided he had 3 choices. He could convert them, he could redirect them, or he could move them out. And he did a little of both. Some of those people, there was a woman here, she was the president of the Daughters of the Confederacy. She was pro-segregation. He found a way to move her out. There were others, very wealthy woman who had more money than she knew what to do with. She was a widow. He found a way to redirect. Let's use your money to build a school for people who can't afford an education. And then there were people he converted. And we can see over time there were a lot of those. People he started to just say, here I am and what I believe, and they started to say, we see it. We see what you're saying. He believed in what we call the social gospel. He believed that you needed to take the teaching of Jesus and apply it to systems. He thought that Christianity had gotten distracted. He called Christianity an old man. Here he says, an old man chattering and mumbling the silly, meaningless reminiscences of a long past youth, utterly oblivious of the actual facts of the present time. That's what he understood the church to be, and said it's time to rethink that Christianity has had 1900 years. They haven't gotten it right. It's time to rethink. Now, to be clear, he was a Christian. He called himself a Christian till he died. But he wanted to bring a new life into Christianity. And his way of doing that is through the social gospel, which is to say, take the teachings of Jesus and apply them to the real world. What does this really mean? How do we, in fact, talk about sin as a social system? How do we talk about systems that don't work? Instead of looking at, say, a woman who steals bread and saying she is sinful, how do we say, what is the system that required her to steal bread? What is the system? It isn't on, he would say, necessarily even the person who owned the bread. It's not his fault or her fault. It is the fault of an economic system that seems to require that some people have and some people don't. And he thought Christianity needs to be addressing this, or Christianity is irrelevant. And so he was calling his people to understand that they were part of a system that was broken, and that if we want to talk about sin, that's where we find it. In addition to economic justice, he was concerned with racial justice. So he arrived here in 1907. In 1909, he gets called into a meeting. The meeting was in Harlem. He was, I think about it now, like, how did he get invited? When I arrived here, someone said, I think that there was a member here who invited him. And I've never really quite been able to track that down. But I did recently learn someone who was a member here, a historian from somewhere else, called me to find something out, and I went, I think I understand the story. The story is that in 1909, he gets invited to a meeting, and in that meeting, the people there said, our people are suffering under bondage, that we are not, in fact, free, that the Civil War moved us out of slavery but not into freedom. And he understood racial justice to have three parts: Reconstruction, and then the move to work, he said, self-determination, but that there was a new part, and the new part was getting rights. And that was really his job now. He felt like he was being invited into this question of rights. That group in 1909 recognized that it was the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln, and they decided that they needed to jump on that. They founded their own organization, we today call it, and they did then call it the NAACP. The group that was in that room worked hard all year to make sure there was some kind of a kickoff event. There was. That is how the NAACP was founded. He was there because a member invited him. I now know that it was Mary Ovington, that she founded the NAACP and brought her minister along. He was committed to racial justice. New York City, I think we like to feel good about New York City, but the reality in New York City at the time was that we were segregated. We were not legally segregated, though. We were segregated by social convention. So it wasn't that we had Jim Crow laws. It wasn't that you weren't allowed. There weren't signs that said you're not allowed. It was simply, you don't do that. This isn't how we do things. So he decided to do things. He was just going to do it. He was going to do it his own way. And he did things like invited his friends, and he would go to the theater. He loved the theater. He loved the opera. He would buy 5 tickets the day before, and then he would bring his friends. He would be 5 friends, 3 white, 2 black. And he would go right before the curtain, when everyone is there and it's nice and crowded, and he would hand in his tickets. And inevitably, they would say, oh, we're so sorry. Those tickets, we made a mistake, and someone's already in those seats. And he would say, no problem, I'll go talk to them. And they said, no, there's actually a problem with the row, the whole row. It's not, the row isn't going to work. And he would push. And the idea was, when they agreed in advance, that the people of color wouldn't talk, that there would never be a reason to say that they shouldn't be allowed in. All they would do is arrive with their tickets. And he did it regularly, this group of friends. And often enough, they were let in. Now, often enough, he was also arrested. They also would take him in, they would come up with reasons, but there was no law. He kept saying, there's no law. This was just social convention. He also did it on elevators. He would walk into buildings with people of color and they'd walk onto the elevator. And the elevator operator would say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And he would say, you absolutely can, and I'm not getting off. You have a choice. I'll sit right down. I'll wait for you, but we're going up. And he did it over and over again. In the 1950s, when he was looking back, he was particularly proud of this moment. He felt like he was able to actually do something. Apparently, on the corner of 5th and 34th, in the 1950s, there was a black officer, and he took great joy in a black man on the corner of 34th and 5th telling all the white people when they could cross and when to wait, and that everyone would just follow him. And he said, and they do it without thought. They have no idea how hard we worked and all we had to do to make it so that they would all follow what this man tells them. I'm going to tell you, I was thinking this while Darnell was leading the choir. I don't know this for sure. I don't know how many directors, I'm trying to think what your title is, director of music, we've had here who were people of color, but I can feel Reverend John Haynes Holmes being happy about this choir and just feeling like, yes, that was the vision, that's what I'm talking about, that's what I've been working on. And how casually we do that today. And I'm gonna stop talking soon, but I just want to tell you one more thing. I want to tell you about nonviolence, because this is actually the place where everything sort of gets clear. In 1916, Wilson is preparing to go to war. I should also, can I just back up? Can I tell you that the number of important people here, and this matters in terms of this next story, but this is how Holmes tells the story. He says, I got a phone call from the Secret Service, and they told me that President Taft was coming to worship. That's how he tells the story. That's the whole story. His closest friend, though, tells him the story another way. He says, here's the real story. His name is Rabbi Stephen Wise. He said, my phone rings, and it's Holmes. He's upset. He's really agitated. He says it's urgent. He doesn't know what to do. The Secret Service just called. President Taft is coming to worship. And Wise says, oh my God, I know. I actually know that because I told him, I saw him, he's a Unitarian. I said, next time you're campaigning in New York, it was a campaign season, you should come and hear my friend over at Church of the Messiah. And Holmes says, here's the problem. Taft is a Republican. And my sermon today is called, Why Everyone Should Vote for the Progressive Party. And Wise says, I don't really know what to tell you. I think you just have to, go with it. see what happens. And he does. He goes. Taft comes to worship that day. Holmes gets up. He used to preach at a thing like that high. He would get up, he would preach, and he said everything he wanted to say. Essentially, don't vote for that guy. When Rabbi Wise then saw his friend, President Taft again, he said, how did that go? And Taft laughed and said, the only thing he didn't do is ask me to donate money to my opponent. I tell that story in part because, while it's a cute and funny story, and it's sort of interesting to me that the president was coming for worship, it also has to do with an ongoing relationship with President Taft. In 1916, President Wilson is getting the country ready for war, and he's telling everybody to prepare. And they had what they called the preparedness campaign, and they opened an office of preparedness. And he wrote to Holmes and said, I want you to sign my letter to tell everybody to prepare. He asked a few key clergy, and they all signed it, except for Holmes, who wouldn't sign it. He said that the letter was an insult to his profession. He said this right to the president, that his work is one of love and not violence, that there may be ministers of Christ who are ready to give comfort for this business, but I am not one of them. On the contrary, I'm pledged to the gospel of love, the task of brotherhood, and the ministry of reconciliation. Everybody, though, was pushing for preparedness. And here in New York in 1917, in the month of February, former President Taft showed up and pushed for the draft. And people were supporting it. The whole city was supporting it. It's time for conscription. Ministers were calling for their own members to sign up. Columbia University announced that it was converting some of its space for an armory, and that they were creating a place for rifle practice. There was a minister up in Morningside Heights who had this dramatic, he marched in early in worship, and he was behind the choir is singing, and they have a huge American flag, and he comes in behind them and announces to everyone that he is going to join the army to fight for this country. That's what was happening in New York City. And Holmes was called, come on, what are you doing? We need you. And he said nothing. And then he went away for a week. He decided he needed time for retreat. He spent a week in silence, which I just want to say for a note, this is because he's a man. Because if he was a woman and he was also married with kids, there's no going away for a week. I just want to say that. But okay, he went away for a week in silence to figure out what he was going to do. And he goes to his congregation, and he has told them he's going to tell them. It's April 1st. He writes a sermon. He titles A Statement to My People on the Eve of War. And he says the place was packed. He usually, like I said, would preach from something like that. He didn't. He did what I'm doing now. He came to be with people. And he preached this sermon, and in it he said that he cannot support this war. He said, the judgment and ethics of war is wrong, an open and utter violation of Christianity. If war is right, Christianity is wrong, false, a lie. If this means a fine, I will pay it. If it means imprisonment, I will serve my time. If it means persecution, I will carry my cross. No order of a president or governor, no order of nation or state, no loss of reputation, freedom, or life will persuade or force me into the business of killing. On this issue, for me at least, there is no compromise. So long as I am your minister, this pulpit will answer to no military summons. Other pulpits may preach recruiting sermons, mine will not. Other parish houses may be turned into drill halls or rifle ranges, ours will not. Other clergy may pray for military victory, I will not. In this church, if nowhere else in all America, the Germans will still be included in the family of God's children. No word of hatred shall be spoken against them, no evil fate shall be desired upon them. So long as I am priest, this altar shall be consecrated to human brotherhood, and before it shall be offered worship only to that one God and Father of us all, who made of one blood all nations of men to dwell together on the face of this earth. He went on to say, nothing is at stake that is worth a human life. Nothing is happening that cannot be determined in a way other than killing. And so he wouldn't do it. Now here's what's interesting to me. The church didn't know what to do with that statement. The Board of Trustees got together the next day, and they went into a room, and I'm going to tell you that 12 reporters waited outside the room. They wanted to know what was going to happen. They thought that he was about to be fired. He thought he was about to be fired. He waited for the Board of Trustees. He said it was a weirdly short meeting. They came out pretty quickly. And this is our Board of Trustees. Our Board of Trustees came out and they said this. They said, you know what? Here's the thing. None of us agree with him. Like he said it was really casual about it. It was like, there's one guy in there who agrees, and the rest of us, no, we actually think we should go to war. But that wasn't the question before us. He said the question before us is, should this be the man in our pulpit? And we all decided, yeah, actually, that in fact, the minister should say things we didn't want to hear. He should say things that we don't agree with. He should say things that make us uncomfortable. And it isn't really up to us to fire him every time he says something that we don't like. The reporters were like, seriously? They wrote it all down. They reported it. It went national. People couldn't believe it. Freedom of the pulpit. The congregation doesn't push you out if you have said something they don't like. It was big. And I get the feeling I'm talking too long, so I'm not actually going to even tell you about Gandhi. You want to hear about Gandhi? Okay, I'll tell you really quickly. Really quickly. As long as it has to be. I shouldn't quit. Okay, I will short. Okay. So here's the story. So here he is now. He has made this bold statement. His church has decided to keep him, and he's feeling kind of lost. Now, this part I will make really quick. He then started getting together with a group of friends, and they were saying, look, if I'm allowed to say this from my pulpit, other people said, I'm going to say it from my pulpit too. And some other people in New York and across the country and some religious leaders started to say things like, you know what, we actually don't think that this is a just war. But this little group of people, they were saying, are we allowed to say that? Like, I think it's treason, because we are at war. We declared war 6 days later. And they, like, are we allowed? And they said, well, I mean, theoretically we're allowed, right? Because the Constitution tells us that we can say things. So the brief message there is that little group formed the ACLU. They were like, maybe we need a lawyer. And they created an organization to protect Holmes and his friends and their ability to say what they wanted to say, even though it was what they were afraid was going to be considered treason. But Holmes was feeling a little lost. He was feeling like he needed a guide. He was going to the New York Public Library. He hung out there a lot. He was trying to find articles on conscientious objection. He found an article that mentioned a guy in India. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. And the reporter seemed to know almost nothing about him. It was a tiny little note that there was this man who was leading this movement, trying to move England out of India non-violently. That was it. There was a note. It was like a line in an article. I called the reporter. The reporter said, I know nothing else. I just know that this guy, I was in London and they were talking about this guy, so I think that it's a thing, but I don't know. He was able to figure out, sort of how to find the guy, but even at that point, in 1918, he couldn't even really do that, but he sort of was, writing to people in London to see, is there anything anyone knows? Then he makes this weirdly bold move, and he says it's the strangest thing that he did this. He doesn't even know why he did it, why he had the audacity. But he wrote a sermon, and by the way, before writing a sermon, it was always in the New York Times, what Holmes was going to preach on. He wrote a sermon called The Greatest Man in the World. He had a single line in an article, but that was the name of his sermon. And he talked about this guy that he didn't know anything about. He wrote a whole sermon, preached all about him. He said a lot of it he sort of was conjecture. The sermon gets printed, right? So the day after, he then writes up his sermons, he gets them printed. He used to sell them for 5 cents the next Sunday. Gets printed. Somehow the sermon makes its way to India. Gandhi sees the sermon. Gandhi makes the sermon public to say someone in the United States is paying attention to what's happening here. The British rulers were like, oh, that's interesting. You've gone international. It becomes important to Gandhi's movement that this man knows him. In 1921, Holmes goes to London to find what kind of information can he get. He gets an address. Gandhi and Holmes become pen pals. They actually become very good friends. By the 1930s, Gandhi is using Holmes as a source of information and advice. They are genuinely good friends, warm. They're in contact, and Holmes is using Gandhi as a real as a guide, as a spiritual guide. He sees him as his spiritual teacher. I will one day make this story, I can bring this story all around. Martin Luther King knew well the Unitarians, knew well many of Holmes's teachers. I don't know that there was a connection between King and Holmes, but there was a connection between Martin Luther King and Gandhi. He also saw him as a teacher, used his practices. When I think about Holmes's practice around the theaters and the elevators, that became largely part of what King was doing. I'm going to have to find out where that connection is, but I'm heading off to the Library of Congress this summer to see if I can find letters between Gandhi and Holmes and between maybe Holmes and King. I am going to end this with a quote from Holmes. I could go on and on and on. There's so much to tell you. But he wrote this to his congregation, and since we are his congregation, I will read it to you. He says, "Lastly, may I congratulate you, as I am congratulating myself on the high adventure of the Spirit which we undertake, and appeal without apology and frankness unashamed for your support. I call to my people in this church to join hands and hearts in this great enterprise, the enterprise of faith, not to divide, but to unite you. For it is in the challenge of high aim and struggle which alone can hold us to accord. I call as well to my people outside this church, strangers and friends alike who have turned from the church of the past, but still devout in expectancy and love, have waited long for the new church. Our vision may be dim, our purpose weak, but we are trying for something higher and better than humans have ever known. And we need all the help that you can give. We need your money. Bills can't be paid without it. We need your names. A body cannot exist and labor without members. We need your love. Your hearts must falter if we have it not. To all to hear these words I speak, to all who read them when they are printed, to all whom rumor may inform or question, I cry out, come, join us. To go on alone were not so hard. I can do it if it be necessary. The blazed trail as well as the broad avenue knows the footsteps of the Lord. The wilderness and the solitary place as well as the crowded city is the abode of God. But better than loneliness is comradeship. The explorer may see from afar the promised land. The pioneer may spy it out. But it is the marching host that enters to conquer and possess. To you all, therefore, I lift my cry. To us all, he lifts his cry.